is in designing user-friendly digital interfaces. This includes websites, games, apps, data visualizations. However, my background historically was in print design and branding, and I do illustration as well. So a lot of different skills in the visual set. So great design helps you reach your audience, increase credibility, and achieve organizational goals. However, oftentimes you're left completely on your own to throw a design together, and maybe there's not budget to hire a professional designer, and you just kind of got to figure things out. So this session here isn't exactly going to be Design 101, which would be like the first step of becoming a professional designer. This is more catered to giving people who have no visual design skills at all a few tips and resources just to make the best of your situation, hoping maybe you'll feel a little bit less lost if you have to bring something together on your own. So all of my advice is going to be relatively on the conservative side, so if there's any designers in the room, you might not get much out of this. So I'm going to cover the importance of content strategy before I dive into the basics of design, including composition, whitespace, color, typography, and imagery. I'm also going to go through some sources of inspiration you could use and some free resources that could help along the way. So why does it matter to spend time on design? Good design helps you communicate more effectively. It conveys professionalism, trustworthiness, and it's effective. It increases the likelihood of you achieving your goal and your organizational goals. 75% of users admit to making judgments about a company's credibility based on their website's design. So that's a pretty important and impressive percent. But before I dive into all of the visual aspects, I just want to reiterate that opening a design program is absolutely not the first step. It's imperative to put some thought into what it is that you're actually setting out to do and what it is you want to communicate to your audiences. So at Atten, we have a pretty thorough strategy process. Assuming that all of you might not have the time or resources to go into this much detail and planning, I'm going to boil this down into a much simpler approach, but just for a little background, Atten can go through user stakeholder surveys, goals and KPIs, audiences, personas, go through a core model exercise, voice and tone, user stories, content analysis, card sorting, analytics, sitemap, usability testing, content maps, and wireframes, all to make sure that we are building the right thing or designing the right thing. But I will boil this down to a much simpler approach if you're kind of in a hurry. So the first step is figuring out what your message is or what it should be. And you can do this by focusing on your goals and what it is you're setting out to accomplish. What is it that you want to happen? What do you want your audience to do or act on when they see your design? What is the actual message that you need to convey? And what is the most efficient way in communicating that message? That's the essence of design. It's not all about the visuals or the aesthetics or all of the drop shadows and bells and whistles and rainbows and unicorns. We're all setting out to achieve an actual goal. And then after you make something, just make sure you step back and ask yourself if this quickly and clearly communicates what it is you're trying to accomplish. So when you make anything, it's important to keep in mind the perspective of who you're talking to. Try your best to put yourself in their shoes. Consider how much time they have. Usually it's not a lot. People don't really read all the paragraphs you think they might on the web. Being concise is super important. What would you need to know? What could you leave out? Think about what draws you in when you're looking at a website or flyer or whatever it is that you're designing. Who would you want to be involved? And what would appeal to your audiences? And prioritize that when you're working through a design. This might sound kind of obvious, but make sure you're remembering that your audiences don't know everything that you know. So talk to them, see what they need to learn, and then make sure you're explaining everything and making decisions as if your audience has absolutely no context to explain things really clearly. Voice and tone is an exercise Atten usually goes pretty thoroughly in depth to figure out what our audiences need and what our clients need. But in a nutshell, we basically just need to make sure that the overall voice and tone we're communicating is on brand and appropriate for your specific audiences. Different colors and typography would be needed for a variety of different audiences, where they're making like a baby shower invitation or like a death metal show flyer. Like different colors and different colors and typography would be necessary for each. You can't just kind of go with the default and use that for absolutely everything. And likewise, your favorite colors and fonts might not be appropriate for your audiences or what it is you're trying to communicate. So you really need to think about what is and isn't appropriate for a specific situation. So before I dive into the design portion, there's a few things to keep in mind. Make sure you remember your goals and audiences. Keep it simple. Focus on content. Be concise. And consider your context. So this is my primary word of advice, just to keep it simple. It's super easy to get carried away with special effects you've just learning out. I'm a victim of this as well, and I do this every day. Don't go overboard with borders, watermarks, drop shadows, all that fun stuff that is really fun to play with when you're working in some design software, but in the end, as a user or a viewer of something, it might just end up getting in the way. So I always like to prioritize designing materials that are effective, not necessarily pretty. Because at the end of the day, it's not about looking pretty, it's about communicating. Focus on the content. When it comes to design, admit your weaknesses and focus on your strengths. Don't attempt to use skills that you're not completely comfortable with if it's for a wide audience. For example, maybe you're really good at writing and you have a great message to communicate. Just think of a clever headline and make that really big, and don't worry about the colors or bells and whistles as much. So in keeping goals and audiences at the forefront of our minds, at Atten we do a core model exercise to explore the intersection between user tasks and organizational goals. This might be overkill for a lot of random things you might need to design, but it's good to keep this strategy aspect in mind when we're working through a new project or website or whatever it might be. So in the core model exercise, first we define our overarching business goals, and then go through user tasks and find out what it is the task that we need to perform, and then decide what that item is, or what like a page on a website is that will meet that need. And then we go through and define, well, how is it that people will arrive at this page? And then once they're there, where do we want them to go? Which is the inward pass and forward pass on the left and right side of this. And then very last, we establish, well, if we're coming from here and we want them to go here, what do we need for them? What content do we need to include to achieve that goal? I think I already said this before, but definitely be concise. Include the absolute bare minimum to get your point across, because people are busy, they don't have time to read paragraphs, so might as well get to the point. Less is always more. Just always ask yourself, can I achieve this goal without having this information included? And if you can, just get rid of it. Also consider where something is going to end up. What's surrounding what it is you're designing if it's not on the web, like if it's a print material or a flyer. If it's a flyer, if you're putting it on a bulletin board at a grocery store or something, go take a look at the grocery store and see what the backdrop is like. And if all of the flyers are black, maybe you should make yours white. Or if they're all red, maybe you should make yours yellow. Just an example. I don't know if I actually recommend that. Just think about what would give your piece contrast against all of the other competition around it. And also think about your final product and any limitations associated with how it's going to be produced. If you're printing something and if it's going to be in color and you don't have a Pantone book available to use, or if you don't even know what a Pantone book is, just remember that some colors print differently than what you see on screen. They usually print a little bit duller and darker once they actually come out. So keep that in mind, and maybe you might want to end up making your color on screen super bright so it prints at the color you're actually expecting to see. Also, if you're printing something at home or at work on a desktop printer, I recommend not designing with full bleed unless you have a lot of time on your hands and want to cut everything out perfectly. And that means making sure there's ample margins around what you're designing. So the item on the left here is a design with full bleed, meaning the ink goes all the way to the edge of a page. And if you set that up in your design software and then hit print, it'll actually turn out something like what's on the right with that white frame around it, which sometimes isn't ideal. It's just something to keep in mind when you're working on your computer. So now that we've covered a few basics in planning, let's dive into the details about all of the elements and principles of design and how those play a role in whatever it is you're creating. So when you're laying out a design and considering all those goals and audiences that we just talked about, arrange your content by priority level, just remembering that people are busy. You want to get to the main points first and then just hope they might get to the end. Sometimes it helps to make a sketch. Sketching is a great way to quickly iterate ideas and then land on the final solution you want to end with without going through the effort of moving things around on the desktop and kind of going back and forth a lot. If you're doing something more complicated, like maybe designing a website, you could consider making a wireframe, just making the most important things large and clear and the less important details smaller, or just omit them. I also recommend tackling the layout first if you're designing something like a flyer or even a website, really. That is kind of a benefit of wireframes. This way you can ensure you have a really solid composition, which could help you out in the long run if you run short on time, and then add colors and bells and whistles later on if needed. Alignment is super important to consider. Always use a grid. If you're not familiar with grids, this means being consistent with the placement of different objects on your screen along predefined increments. This is an example of something that's not exactly using a grid, and there's a lot of mixtures of alignment here, which makes it a little hard to just glance at and get an idea of what's going on here quickly. Always avoid having floating objects and try to anchor them in a relationship to each other, and again, just always keep it simple. This design would be a lot more successful if they had some content prioritization and a little bit of alignment help, because there's some things are left aligned, some things are center aligned, and some things are just kind of floating off in the middle. This is an example of a flyer that's a little more consistent with alignment, and they've prioritized what it is they want to communicate. Just making sure that all of the elements are visually anchored. Whitespace is an invaluable asset to design. It is absolutely not wasted space, even though I've heard people say that so many times. It serves multiple important purposes. It makes less opportunity for distraction, kind of like we saw in that last example. It helps emphasize your focal points, and it kind of just generically looks a little luxurious. It makes things look professionally done. And again, that leads to increased credibility and trust in some of those statistics I shared earlier. Good use of white space between paragraphs and in left and right margins increases reader comprehension by almost 20%. That's pretty significant. So from a more utilitarian standpoint, it has the power to improve legibility and get people to actually absorb the information you're trying to communicate. Readers find it easier to focus on and process generously spaced content. This is an example of the opposite, so don't do this. And again, when people are able to quickly absorb information, it's more likely your goals will be met. So where do we need white space? We need it around items, between borders and text, between lines of text, between content and the edge of a page. And just to be clear, this example shows all the white space being white, but it's not always white. If you have a green background, you can call it green space if you want, but it's synonymous with padding, cushion space, negative space, whatever you want to call it. In the context of legibility, one key task of white space is establishing visual relationships and associations between different elements on a page. For example, in this image of a website element, it's a call out for a catalog item at a library. It's kind of hard to absorb the content, understand how each of those pieces fit together and what the relationships are. But when you prioritize your white space and establish a hierarchy, it's clear what items are associated with what. And that was just one little bit of a whole website. It's important to consider the entire system when you're thinking about white space, especially for websites. In order to maintain the scale and the hierarchy between very closely related elements, on the opposite end of the spectrum, you're going to need a really large amount of white space to differentiate the separate sections. So in this example, to show how things are related, we need to have number 1 here as the largest amount of space, and number 4 is the smallest amount of space, which is just between like lines in a paragraph. And then we need to differentiate the paragraphs, the lines within a paragraph between other paragraphs, which is represented by number 3. And number 2 represents a subsection within a larger section, which is number 1. So it all kind of scales up and down, and you need to make sure that all of the choices you're making as far as white space goes in a small scale affects how you have it on a larger scale. So I feel like I always have clients asking me like, oh, why is there such a huge amount of space there? And I always have to explain something like this where, well, in order to show the relationships between like 6 different layers of subcontent, we need to have enough cushion space to be able to like filter down that hierarchy. Images absolutely play an important role in communicating with your audience and also kind of getting them interested in what it is you're trying to communicate. And it's important to understand what resources you have available and develop a strategic plan for utilizing that imagery. You need to think about where images might be needed so they can be seamlessly incorporated into your design. And on a different note, just ask, do images need to be included at all? A few of those examples I shared were pretty effective without having very many images. You also need to consider what types of images should I think about? What does your audience actually need to see before they're motivated to take action? And think about what types of images you'll need. You need headshots, landscapes, logos, drawings, diagrams, a little bit of everything. Different images may require different treatment, and this especially applies to on the web, because I've definitely been involved in website projects where there wasn't much communication between the design and development teams, and all of a sudden we have this image space available, and it's an image just cropped completely. It was a space for a headshot, but then somebody's head got chopped off because there was cropping involved. So we need to make sure we have good communication between teams at all times to make sure that everything is considered within context. And also think about if imagery speaks on its own, that's awesome, but sometimes it doesn't, and you'll need to include a caption to make sure that people understand what's going on. And if it's going to be an image on a website, make sure you don't include text as part of the images, because screen readers and search engines are going to completely miss that. And it's also really difficult to edit later on down the road when you want to change that image. So adding photography is probably the most common and easiest way to add visual interest to a design, but sometimes how easy it is backfires a little bit. and we should always avoid using the cheesiest varieties of stock photography, headsets, handshakes, anything like this here. But professional photography is ideal and usually worth the investment, but sometimes it's just not possible and you have to figure out photography on your own. But you can actually make pretty fine-tuned images, and successful and professional looking images, just with your phone or a regular camera and a little bit of editing help. Editing can transform an image so much that it's really worth it to either learn how to work a more complicated image editing software like Photoshop or GIMP, the free version I think I'll mention, but if you don't have time for that, there's always room to use an app really quickly just to make a low light image look a little better. So when you're taking your own pictures, always be aware of your light source. DIY photos usually turn out better outside, so if you're taking a picture of an object or like a group of people, if you can get them outside, if the weather's great, I mean around here it usually is, just go outside and take your photos there. But absolutely keep in mind that if you're taking photos indoors on just a regular camera or some older phones, you might need to do a lot of editing to make that look a little more professional after the fact. Yes, go ahead.
It also helps if you can get some additional lighting into it.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, people don't understand that, but if you have something, and you should not use it directly, you should reflect it or diffuse it.
Absolutely. And if you don't have professional photography supplies, you can do some DIY stuff that'll have pretty decent results as well. I've definitely taken like lampshades off of lamps in my house and like awkwardly pointed them towards some object I was trying to take a photo of. When you're taking the photo, nobody sees the backdrop, they just see what you took a photo of. But yeah, that's a great comment, thank you. Resolution is also super important. Never scale images up. It's going to look pixelated like that image on the top right there. And keep in mind what resolution you need for what it is you're working on. And also think about if you need to have a high enough resolution for a digital project to take Retina devices into account. And this also might seem a little obvious, but if you don't really have great quality images, it's really helpful to just admit that up front and work with what you have or don't have, and then don't make a design that relies heavily on imagery, or just use a tasteful treatment that could maybe enhance the imagery that isn't so great, like you can put a color overlay on it, maybe some sort of illustrative treatment. That might require a little stronger of a skill set, but color overlays or blurs could also help you out too in a pinch. GIMP is a open source option if you can't afford Photoshop, but this is if you want to do the level of detailed photo editing that Photoshop provides. Otherwise, there are quicker and easier options. If you're on a desktop, Pixlr is a web app that opens right in your browser that has options almost similar to Photoshop and GIMP. Otherwise, any photo filters you have and any app you're using, that could be the next best thing. Just keep in mind not to overdo it and don't make it too crazy. So this is an example of a photo that desperately needs editing, but it's kind of hard to see in this lighting, but I can assure you it's very dull and gray, and if you're actually on this beach wearing socks and shoes, it would be so much brighter. So the first thing I look at when I'm editing a photo is the brightness. I feel like that's the #1 thing you can do to improve a photo. And in software like Photoshop, just adjust brightness and contrast, and that's a really quick thing to do. But if you have a little bit more time or patience or skills, you can adjust the curves to make sure that the darkest parts of your photo are near black and the lightest parts of your photo are near white. So there's that full spectrum there. After you've brightened up your photo, take a look at the colors. A lot of images that you take aren't actually as bright as they are in real life, so adding some saturation to make it not oversaturated but match real life accurately is a really great thing to do. Also, adjusting color balance helps a lot. Add in the opposite color, like you have an image that's looking a little blue, add in some orange, and that'll make it look more neutral and natural. And like I was mentioning with photography earlier, imagery taken indoors, those always look a little on the warm side, so making those images a little cooler always helps. And sometimes, depending on the lighting outside, images outside could look a little too cool, and you need to warm them up to bring it to the actual color spectrum you saw in real life when you took that photo. And obviously there's exceptions, so just keep an eye out. Also think about the subject of your photo filling the entire frame. Sometimes, like when I go on vacation and somebody takes a photo of me and like at some beautiful waterfall, they frame it so my body is completely blocking the beautiful waterfall behind me. Just make sure you're keeping in mind what it is you want to take a photo of, and make sure those objects are in the photo when you're taking them. But also make sure you crop your images with ample cushion space around your focal point. So if photos aren't available or an option for what you're working on, illustrations and icons are available and plentiful online. You just have to be tasteful about which ones you select. I have a bunch of resources available that I'll include on the slides when I post them for sharing, but I'll go through a few now. Just make sure you're being smart about which images you select and avoid clip art. But if you absolutely have to, opt for the simplest style you can. But I would recommend going to a slightly more professional online source than something available in Microsoft Word or something. And also avoid collages unless you really know what you're doing. So there's tons of free icon resources, and a lot of these could be scaled up and used as a simple illustration as well, which I feel like is an opportunity that not enough people harness. Is when you think of having an illustration, it needs to be very complex and detailed, but not necessarily. And again, it depends on what it is you're trying to communicate. So this resource is called Flat Icon. The noun project is also a good option, although you have to be careful with some of these. They require attribution just to make sure that you're respectfully using other people's work. Icon Monster, I think, is a little more liberal in their policy, where I don't think you actually do need to attribute whoever created it. So just be careful with all of these free resources if it's actually okay to use for free, or if you need to include attribution and you probably can't access it if it's something you have to pay for. And since these are all vectors, and if you're assuming you're using a vector software to add them, you can scale these up and down as large or as small as you want, and they don't lose any image quality. And you can recolor them really easily as well. All right, some things to consider when using logos. They absolutely do not have to be huge. Sometimes smaller is better, and it can be a little more, having your logo smaller can actually come off as your organization being more confident or more professional. And also consider your background color. If you need to include lots of different logos, like say you have a bunch of sponsor logos to work with, keep in mind what backdrop they're going to go on and what types of logo files you have. Because a lot of times I would design for a footer full of logos and I want the background to be purple. But then all the logos that I actually receive from a client might be JPEGs, so they might end up having a little box around them. So that's always something that I like to communicate with my clients. What exactly do we have available as far as logos go? Do we have the flexibility to get vector logos that I can have free reign to color them however I want? Or will they all have a white box around them, and that I should really make sure I have a white background on them to make them look as professional as possible? Because those tightly cropped white boxes look a little tacky. So when it comes to dealing with logos, take a look at your brand guidelines. And if you don't have brand guidelines, it helps just to find somebody else's, because a lot of them have approximately the same recommendations, where you're never supposed to stretch the logo, you should always hold down shift when you're resizing it, never add any gradients, don't add distracting backgrounds, and don't manipulate it in any way. I feel like a lot of branding guidelines I see go into extreme detail with things like this, and it's always kind of amusing what kind of awkward manipulations they come up with and think people might do, and say, no, don't add a picture of a pony behind it, and whatever. Just use it in its natural state. Clean typography is super important to help convey your message. Typography should absolutely not be distracting, so be really careful if you decide to use a display font. Otherwise, I would just say keep it simple. These are a few fonts I would recommend avoiding using unless you're trying to be ironic or something. And if you're really not sure, just Google the name of your font and see if there's like a cult following around it of terrible examples. And also steer clear of word art. I used to love this, maybe like 20 years ago when I was first learning what computers were. But never stretch text, always hold down shift. I always recommend avoiding using bold, underline, and italics for emphasis. I always recommend just making whatever that item or text is bigger rather than adding exclamation marks or some sort of decoration around it. So in selecting fonts, there are a lot of free options available. I really like Google Fonts because it is very simple to add to a website or download to use on print materials. And if you're intimidated by all the type choices, I would say just to stick with something simple, and mixing a bunch of different types of fonts can be a little dangerous. And if you're not really comfortable with that, it's pretty safe just to stick with the same font and use it everywhere, but find a font that has multiple weights. I feel like a good cue in like browsing through Google Fonts is to see how many weights a font has, and usually that's kind of a good cue that it's a pretty decent font, although, and pretty flexible of a font. Although, of course, that's not a hard and fast rule by any means. It's just a good indicator. And a little bit lesser known is Font Squirrel, for a source for free fonts. They, to my knowledge, don't offer web fonts as frequently. Actually, this one does, so I take that back. Font Squirrel is an alternative to Google Fonts, but maybe they'll make it big someday. It's also a really great idea to get ideas from sources online of people who know what they're doing when it comes to typography. Fonts in Use is a website that I really like to go to for typeface inspiration. And TypeWolf is another good resource to see real-life examples of font combinations used on the web in the wild. Make sure you organize your content according to a type hierarchy. A strong type hierarchy really helps make whatever it is you're making more scannable. When you have big, bold headings, you can really get your point across really efficiently. So make your headlines big and any subheadings of equal importance all the same size and weight on a scale of hierarchy. So this is a pretty decent example of type prioritization, just considering what you're making, who's going to read it, and where it'll end up. Sometimes making your headline super big is the way to go. Definitely avoid long line lengths for legibility. There's been a lot of studies about how wide you can go with a row of text before your eye just gets completely lost in finding the next row. On the web, it's usually like, I don't know, in the ballpark of 700 to 750 pixels wide, like size 18 font, so it's probably not very useful information, but you don't really want to have long line lengths, especially in body copy, just to make sure that everything is easy to absorb. Also, make sure that any text you have on top of an image has enough contrast to be clearly readable, and make sure you're considering users with visual impairments and making sure that your fonts are large enough to be read. Just because you might be a young person making a design doesn't mean that everybody has the same vision skills that you do who are viewing it. Dashes are something that have always been near and dear to my heart because I've always been interested in both design and typography and also grammar, and this is kind of the combination of both of them. But it's important to make sure you're using the right dash. They're not all the same, and I feel like people use hyphens for absolutely all contexts, but there's actually a few different types of dashes. Hyphens are only supposed to be used in hyphenated words like merry-go-round or noise canceling, and that's just the button you press when you want a hyphen on your keyboard. So that's super simple and why people always default to that one. End dashes, however, are a little bit longer. They're the same length as a capital letter N, and those are primarily used to express range or duration. So like 3 to 4 o'clock or A to Z, Monday through Thursday. In my opinion, I would use end dashes in most places I see people using hyphens. That's kind of hard to make a blanket statement about. And then there's em dashes, which are used for added emphasis or between different clauses in a sentence. You use these similarly to how you use a semicolon. People also replace them with two hyphens, which isn't the best, but I have been noticing more and more text boxes are auto-correcting that to the actual em dash, which makes me so happy because it's easy for people to use who don't know the keystrokes to make an en dash or em dash on the fly. But I think it would be awesome if more people would memorize these keystrokes so it comes naturally. Or having to Google en dash or em dash and copy and paste it into your document is also not super fun either. But in my opinion, worth it if that's what you got to do. So color is also an impactful way to communicate to your audience and really reflect the voice and tone you need to communicate. If you're using predefined photos or branding elements, keep those colors in mind when you're selecting a palette. You want to make sure that colors, photography, logos all need to work together, not against each other. And definitely be consistent between materials. Use the same colors for flyers and websites, all to make your brand for your organization cohesive. So it's easy to get carried away with color palettes, but I recommend sticking with 1 or 2 colors if you don't have predefined guidelines to adhere to. Here's an example of a website I designed with a very simple color palette, and the color palette is pretty much black and white, but red is only used for calls to action, which really help users know what it is they can do in this site and how they can actually get involved. If you're doing something where the sky is the limit, you can have a website like Coolers generate a color palette for you, which can be super fun to play with. It does get a little dangerous because unfortunately they don't tell you how you should be using those colors, and they rarely naturally have enough contrast against each other to use that pink on top of that light green would absolutely never work. So just take those with a grain of salt. And absolutely keep in mind those with color blindness or any sort of vision impairment. They make up a larger portion of the population than a lot of people realize. You can test contrast to various accessibility standards with color blindness simulators such as Colorable. This is one of my favorites just because it's so big and nicely designed, but it does the job. You can enter your foreground color in and your background color in, and it'll tell you what standards it meets or if it completely fails all standards. If you happen to be using Sketch, Stark is a plugin you can add that will check your contrast while you're designing something, which is a super efficient way to go. And if you use Chrome, Spectrum is an extension that simulates various vision impairments, so you can actually attempt to get a sense of how different members of your audience might be seeing your work. So here's an example of that Chrome extension up in the top right corner, filtering through different vision impairments, and you can see how drastically different they all are, which doesn't really make a big difference on a site like this where all of the colors aren't really helping communicate meaning, but it does make a huge difference when you're using color to actually communicate something that's a sole means of communicating. So this is just a form that shows various errors in green, yellow, and red. But when you put that in a red-green color blindness simulator, they all look practically the same, and that message is completely lost. Immerse yourself in good design and take notes. That's really the best idea I have for all of you, and that's exactly what I do to further my career. Absolutely never copy a design, but you can get some really great ideas on looking around for layout ideas, color usage, typefaces, and if you just focus on one of those, but then incorporate your own content and branding, it'll be like a completely different piece, and no one will know that you were looking for inspiration. But absolutely do not copy all three of those elements, because somebody might come after you. And they will find you, because it's happened to me and I found them. There's a lot of really great design galleries out there too. Design Inspiration actually allows you to filter different types of design. So you can look for websites specifically, or logo inspiration, print materials, whatever it is you need, you can pre-filter for, and it's rather extensive. And Drupal is also a community of designers that's intended for designers to use to get feedback on their work, but it's really just a great resource of mostly professional designers who just produce good creative work. And it's also a platform where they can just kind of go wild because there's no constraints, so you can get a lot of good inspiration there. And on Drupal you can also search the work by keyword, by color. There's tags, so it's really easy to find exactly what it is you're looking for. So if you're illustrating a camel, you can type in camel and you can click on brown camels, and then you'll see how many people have designed brown camels. So in summary, always remember your goals and audiences. Hold down Shift when you resize absolutely anything, and keep it simple, and always use enough white space. Thanks, everybody. So I'm going to have lists of resources posted in the slides online, and I actually was planning on bringing a whole stack of Atten sketchbooks here, which I completely forgot. So please stop by the Atten table and pick up a sketchbook, because we do not want to fly home with a whole box full of sketchbooks, and we'd love for you to have them. Does anybody have any questions? Comments or tools you want to share with the group? Go ahead.
You didn't quite go over composition too much, but if you're trying to design websites, would you say the best tool is for composing a page that is?
Are you referring to a web page?
Yeah.
So when I have to do something very quick or basic, I like to resort to just a simple one-column website, or maybe two-column. Anything beyond that, if you don't know what you're doing, could get really challenging. And those structures are seen so frequently throughout the web because they are so effective. Anybody else?
Yeah. About the roles of the people, the graphic designer, UX, and to map the design with the developer, are you talking the same language? Do you know about CSS, for example, or are you did mock-ups, or is it just a design with Photoshop and Sketch, or?
To answer some of those questions, I use, no, that's no problem. We currently use Sketch at Atten, but we are entertaining other tools. It's just very difficult to switch tools for a whole organization really quickly, but there are a lot of other great options out there for composing a page. To answer your other question, at Atten, I don't do any front-end CSS at all. I have a very basic level knowledge that I can build my own portfolio sites that are completely static, so I can't call myself a developer at all, but I know enough to make something simple and maybe embarrassing if you looked at my code. And also having been working with front-end developers for the last 10 years or so, I've had similar conversations with them like over and over that I've learned this kinds of feedback they give me that I know what will make their lives miserable and what will make the project run more efficiently.
Yeah.
And that helps a lot. So it's all about having a good communication ethic with your coworkers, essentially.
Yeah, with the developers. Thank you.
Anybody else? Well, thanks so much for your time, everybody. Have a good lunch. Thank you so much for your help.